The town of Creed's Hollow existed in that particular category of places that appear on no official map but exist with absolute certainty in the knowledge of everyone who lives within 50 miles of them. A settlement born from necessity rather than planning, occupying a wide shallow canyon in the New Mexico high desert where a reliable spring had attracted first the Navajo, then the Spanish, then the Americans, each successive group adding their layer to the accumulated human residue of the place without fully displacing what came before. The canyon walls were red sandstone, striated in bands of rust and ochre and deep burgundy that changed color as the sun moved, and the spring at the canyon's head fed a thin creek that ran the length of the settlement before disappearing into the desert floor at the canyon's mouth, as though the land was taking back what it had briefly lent. The buildings along the creek, perhaps 30 of them, timber and adobe in roughly equal proportion, had the look of structures that had made their peace with impermanence without quite giving up. It was here, in the late autumn of 1886, that Asa Dillon received a letter from a dead man. Asa was 44 years old, which he carried in the specific way of a man whose years had been eventful, not old exactly, but thoroughly used, like a good knife that had been worked hard and resharpened so many times that the blade was thinner than it started but held a better edge. He ran a livery stable at the eastern end of Creed's Hollow's single street, a practical and moderately profitable operation that suited both his skills and his fundamental preference for the company of horses over the company of most people. He was tall, spare, with large hands built for heavy work and pale blue eyes that had the quality of distance in them even at close range, eyes that were always looking slightly past what was directly in front of them, towards something further away. He had come to Creed's Hollow 7 years ago from a direction he never specified to anyone who asked, which most people eventually stopped asking because the quality of his silence on the subject communicated clearly that the not asking was preferred. He had built the livery from a collapsed structure in several months of solitary labor, had established himself as the most reliable horseman in the canyon and the most reliable keeper of other people's confidences, and had assembled the kind of quiet, workable life that a man with a complicated past builds when he has decided that the past is finished with him even if he is not entirely finished with it. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in October, delivered by a rider who left it at the livery door without stopping to be seen, which was itself unusual enough that Asa noted it carefully before he opened the envelope. The handwriting on the outside was familiar in a way that took him a moment to place, and when he placed it the recognition hit with the specific, physical quality of unexpected news, a jolt in the chest, a sudden sharpening of everything around him. The handwriting belonged to Frank Dillon, his younger brother, who had been shot and killed in the town of Cimarron 14 months ago during a dispute over a cattle contract, or so Asa had been told by the man who brought him word of it. The letter was dated 6 weeks ago. Inside, in Frank's particular cramped, leftward-leaning script, 4 paragraphs that Asa read 3 times standing in the livery doorway with the morning light coming flat and cold down the canyon. Asa, if you're reading this I'm probably dead by now for real, which means whoever told you I was dead 14 months ago was either wrong or lying, and I need you to know which because it matters for what comes next. I'm alive as of writing this, or was, and I've been hiding in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains for 11 months because someone wants me dead badly enough to have already made one serious attempt and I don't know who to trust enough to come down from the mountains. What I know is this, I have documents. Documents that prove the Cimarron cattle contract dispute wasn't a dispute at all. It was a manufactured excuse to kill me and take what I had evidence of. I can't tell you more in a letter in case this goes wrong. If you come to Cimarron and ask for a man named Cutter at the Red Mesa Saloon, he'll get word to me. Come alone, come careful, and don't trust anyone who knows your name before you've told it to them. Your brother, Frank. Asa read it a 4th time. Then he folded it carefully and put it inside his coat against his chest and went back into the livery and began saddling his horse with the slow, deliberate movements of a man making a decision he has already made and is now simply executing. He had a stable hand, a 15-year-old boy named Pico who had been with him for 2 years and was reliable with the horses in the specific way of someone who genuinely cared about them. He told Pico he'd be gone for an uncertain period, left him enough money for the stable's operating costs for a month, and rode out of Creed's Hollow by mid-morning heading northeast toward Cimarron. He carried 2 guns, a Remington revolver and a short-barreled shotgun in a saddle scabbard, and 7 years of something that had been dormant long enough to have almost convinced him it was gone, but which the letter had awakened with the same reliable persistence of things that never actually go dormant, only wait. The road northeast from Creed's Hollow crossed 70 miles of high desert before the Sangre de Cristo Mountains began to assert themselves against the eastern horizon, first as a dark suggestion, then as a definitive presence, their upper ridgelines already carrying the season's first snow in thin white lines against the deep blue sky. Asa rode through country he knew from 7 years of living at its western edge, Familiar with its particular indifferences and occasional generosities, the water sources that could be trusted and the arroyos that flooded without warning after distant rain. He made good time the first day, camping at a dry wash where underground water sat close enough to the surface that a man who knew where to dig could find it, and lay under the cold desert stars thinking about Frank. Frank Dillon was 38, 6 years younger than Asa, and had spent most of his adult life working cattle, which was the family trade inherited from a father who had come to New Mexico from Kentucky with a young wife, and the specific, optimistic foolishness of someone who believed the West rewarded ambition proportionally. It hadn't, particularly, but it had rewarded persistence well enough that the Dillon family had assembled a modest but real cattle operation over 2 decades of work, which Frank had continued after their parents died in the winter of 1878 while Asa had drifted toward other work, the kind that was better paid and more dangerous, and which Asa had eventually walked away from with the scarred hands and pale, distant eyes that were its primary visible souvenirs. He thought about what Frank had written, documents that proved the Cimarron cattle contract dispute wasn't a dispute at all. Frank had always had the particular stubbornness of the second child, the one who grows up watching the elder sibling make the obvious moves and decides to approach everything from a different angle. If Frank said he had documents, he had them. And if Frank had been in hiding for 11 months and had chosen this moment to reach out, it was because the situation had reached a point where hiding was no longer sufficient. The letter's date, 6 weeks ago, meant Frank had sent it and then continued to wait, and whether Frank was still alive and waiting was the question Asa spent the second day's writing turning over without finding an answer that satisfied him. He stopped at a small trading post on the third morning, at the edge of the mountains, foothills, and asked the proprietor, a Pueblo man of perhaps 60 who had been running the post since before Asa had come to this part of the country, whether there had been any unusual activity on the Cimarron road recently. The old man looked at him with the specific, assessing calm of someone who has been answering questions from travelers for a long time and has learned to read what the question is really asking. "Riders going to Cimarron, nothing unusual," he said. "Riders coming away from Cimarron in a hurry, 2 groups in the last 3 weeks. Heading south." He paused, refilling Asa's coffee cup without being asked. Men in a hurry away from somewhere are usually men who've been told to hurry. He met Asa's eyes. "Whatever you're riding toward, ride careful." Asa thanked him and rode on. Cimarron appeared on the 4th afternoon, nestled in a valley where the Cimarron River came down from the mountains with the confidence of water that has been doing the same thing for long enough to have worn its channel deep. It was a proper town by New Mexico standards, a courthouse, several substantial commercial buildings, a hotel with a second story, and the Red Mesa Saloon, which occupied a corner position on the main plaza that made it visible from 3 directions, which Asa noted as relevant. He rode in without stopping at the main street, taking the back approach along the river road, and secured his horse at a small livery on the town's southern edge run by an old man who asked no questions and received the extra coin Asa pressed into his palm with the professional discretion of someone who understood what the coin was paying for beyond horse care. Then he went to find a man named. The Red Mesa Saloon at 4 in the afternoon held the specific population of a drinking establishment between its midday and evening rushes, a handful of serious drinkers who treated the hour as irrelevant, 2 card players who were either very lucky or very good, and a barkeep who was using the quiet period to conduct a war of attrition against the bar's accumulated grime. Asa stood in the doorway for a moment with the practiced scan that Frank's letter had reactivated as a reflex, noting positions and faces and the single rear exit that opened onto an alley, and then walked to the bar and ordered whiskey he needed for cover rather than desire. "Looking for a man named Cutter," he said, low enough that the words reached the barkeep and no further. The barkeep, a compact, dark-haired man of perhaps 50, did not pause in his cleaning. "Lots of men in Cimarron," he said. "This one specifically," Asa said. "Frank Dillon's friend." The cleaning stopped. The barkeep looked at him with eyes that were now doing their own assessment. "You're Asa," he said, not quite a question. "Frank described you. Said you'd have pale eyes that look like you're always watching something nobody else can see." "That's a generous description," Asa said. "Frank's generous about family." The barkeep, who was, Asa understood now, Cutter himself, glanced once around the room and then at the rear door. "Come back at closing. 10 o'clock. Alone and certain you weren't followed." Asa spent the intervening 6 hours doing what he'd learned to do in the years of work he'd walked away from, making himself invisible in plain sight, moving through Cimarron's streets and establishments with the unremarkable presence of a traveler passing through, seeing everything while appearing to note nothing. What he saw told him several things. The town's sheriff was a young man named Briggs who moved through the town with the specific body language of someone who owed his position to an authority above the electorate. The Cimarron Cattle Company, whose sign occupied a prominent position on the main plaza, had 3 men out front at various points during the evening who were clearly not employees but were clearly present for surveillance purposes. And there was one man, lean, middle-aged, watching the Red Mesa's entrance from a position across the plaza that provided coverage without obvious purpose, who Asa marked as a specific and particular problem before he'd finished his first circuit of the town. At 10 o'clock he entered the Red Mesa through the rear alley door, which Cutter had left unlatched. The barroom was empty, Cutter having closed at 9, a detail Asa noted as deliberate preparation rather than routine. Cutter was waiting at a table in the back with a lamp turned low and 2 cups of coffee that communicated both hospitality and the expectation of a conversation requiring alertness rather than whiskey. "Frank is alive," Cutter said, before Asa had fully sat down. "As of 4 days ago, when his message reached me. He's in a cabin in the Moreno Valley, high up, accessible only on foot for the last mile. He's been there since February." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He sent for you because something changed 3 weeks ago. One of the men who's been looking for him, and there have been men looking for him consistently for 11 months, found the valley. Didn't find the specific cabin, but found the valley, which narrows things to a point where Frank doesn't have much more time before they find the cabin too." "Who are they?" Asa said. "Who's been looking for him and why?" Cutter looked at his coffee for a moment. "You know the Cimarron Cattle Company? I saw their sign today. 3 men out front who weren't employees." Cutter nodded. "The company is run by a man named Harlan Price. He's been in Cimarron for 4 years, came from Texas with significant capital and significant ambition, and has been assembling cattle grazing rights across 3 counties with the specific methodology of someone who doesn't particularly care whether the rights are acquired voluntarily or otherwise." He paused. Frank was grazing his cattle on Mora River bottomland under a lease he'd held for 9 years. Price wanted that bottomland. Frank refused to sell or surrender the lease. What happened next is what Frank documented. "Which is what?" Asa said. "Price's men altered the lease documents in the Territorial Records Office. Changed the expiration date from 1895 to 1882, making Frank's current use appear unauthorized, trespass rather than legal grazing. When Frank confronted Price with his original lease copies, Price had him arrested on trespass charges that required him to surrender his cattle as bond." Cutter's voice was flat and even, narrating facts without editorializing, which told Asa something about Cutter's history that he filed away. Frank got out of jail when a lawyer friend challenged the bond arrangement, but his cattle were never returned. Price's men had moved them into Price's own operation within 24 hours of the arrest. Frank went to document the theft and found evidence of something much larger than his own case. "How much larger?" Asa said. Cutter met his eyes. "Price hasn't just done this to Frank. He's done it to 11 other ranchers across 3 counties over 4 years. Altered lease documents, manufactured trespass charges, seized cattle. The total cattle stolen, and I use that word deliberately, exceeds 8,000 head. At current prices, that's close to $200,000. He paused. "And that's just the cattle. The land the leases covered represents additional value that Price is now effectively controlling." He looked at his coffee. "The man who runs the Territorial Records Office in Santa Fe, where the original leases are filed, is named Commissioner Gerald Pitt. Price paid for his election. Pitt processes the alterations. Local courts, local sheriffs, they see official records and official records say Price is right." He looked up. Frank photographed the original documents, the real ones, before they could be altered. He has copies of 12 lease agreements showing the authentic terms, and he has documentation of the alterations made to the Territorial Office copies. He paused. "That's what they want. That's why they've been hunting him for 11 months. Asa sat with this for a long moment, feeling the shape of it. Not simple theft. Industrial-scale theft, protected by institutional corruption, pursued to the point of hunting a man through the mountains for nearly a year. "I need to get to Frank," he said. "Tonight if possible." The man watching the Red Mesa's entrance from across the plaza, Cutter said. "He's Price's. They've had someone watching this place for 3 weeks, since they found the Moreno Valley." "I know," Asa said. "I'll handle that." Cutter looked at him with the particular expression of someone revising an assessment upward. "Frank said you used to do work that required handling things quietly," he said. "I did," Asa said. "Are you still good at it?" Asa finished his coffee and set the cup down and stood. "I haven't lost much," he said. Unfortunately, handling the watcher across the plaza did not require violence, which was Asa's preference when preference was available to him. What it required was misdirection, the specific, careful work of giving a surveillance operative something to watch that wasn't what was actually happening. Asa exited the Red Mesa through the front door at 10:30, which was later than he'd entered, and walked north up the main street with the unhurried pace of a man heading to his hotel, presenting the unremarkable profile of a traveler winding up his evening. He felt the watcher's attention tracking him and gave it nothing useful to track: consistent pace, no doubling back, no stops at unusual locations. He went to the hotel, confirmed a room, went upstairs, and waited 30 minutes. Then he went out the hotel's window to the rear alley, dropped to the alley floor, and spent the next 40 minutes making his way to the southern livery through the back ways of Cimarron, the spaces between buildings, the alley routes, the shadow-covered paths that every town has for the people willing to move through them rather than the conventional streets. He retrieved his horse, paid the old liveryman an additional coin for his continued silence, and rode out the river road heading east and then north, well clear of the plaza and its watchers. Cutter had given him directions to the Moreno Valley trailhead, a set of landmarks specific enough to navigate in darkness with a good horse, which Ace's horse proved to be. He reached the trailhead at approximately 2 in the morning and tied his horse at the sheltered position Cutter had described, then went on foot up the mountain trail with the darkness and the pine forest close around him and the specific, focused quality of a man who is moving towards something important and has the skills to reach it. The final mile, the foot-only section Cutter had mentioned, climbed through increasingly dense timber over terrain that a horse could not have managed safely. Asa moved it in 40 minutes, which was good time in the dark on unfamiliar ground, guided by the hand-drawn sketch Cutter had provided and the particular way mountain terrain communicates its own logic to someone paying close enough attention to receive it. The cabin was small, one room, built into the hillside in a way that made it nearly invisible from below, using the mountain's own contours as concealment. A thread of smoke from the chimney was the only indication of habitation. Asa stopped 20 feet out and said, quietly, "Frank." "It's Asa." A long silence. Then the cabin door opened 4 inches, and a voice said, "Step into the moonlight where I can see your face." Asa stepped into the clearing's thin moonlight. The door opened fully and Frank Dillon stood in it, thinner than Asa remembered, with 11 months of mountain living and sustained anxiety worn visibly into his face, but alive, standing, and holding a rifle with the particular grip of someone who had been holding it for a long time and had almost forgotten what it felt like not to. When he recognized his brother's face, the grip changed, relaxed, but didn't release entirely, because 11 months of being hunted doesn't fully yield to one moment of relief. "You came," Frank said. "You sent a letter to a dead man," Asa said. "What else was I going to do?" They sat in the small cabin through the remaining night hours while Frank laid out what he'd spent 11 months in the mountains protecting, and Asa listened with the specific, organized attention of someone taking mental inventory of a complex situation's components, needs, and vulnerabilities. Frank's documentation, physical photographs made with a portable camera he'd purchased specifically for this purpose before the situation became dangerous, and handwritten copies of key documents, was stored in an oilskin package wedged between the cabin's floor and the mountain bedrock beneath it. He produced it now and spread its contents across the small table and walked Asa through each element. 12 original lease agreements, or rather, photographs of the originals, showing terms that contradicted the altered versions in the Territorial Records Office. The discrepancies were specific and unambiguous: expiration dates changed, acreage figures adjusted, water access provisions modified or removed. Frank had also managed to photograph 2 of the altered Territorial Office copies directly, during a visit to Santa Fe 6 weeks before things turned dangerous, which meant he had side-by-side evidence of the before and after, the authentic terms and the fraudulent revisions. Beyond the lease documents, Frank had assembled records of the cattle transfers, bills of sale, brand registry changes, transfer documentation, that showed the movement of seized cattle from the 11 affected ranchers into Price's operation under legal cover provided by the manufactured trespass findings. The documentation chain was careful and complete, the work of a man who had understood from the beginning that meticulous records were the only weapon available against institutional corruption. "The problem," Frank said, spreading his hands over the documents, "is getting this in front of someone who isn't already part of it. Commissioner Pitt controls the territorial records. Sheriff Briggs in Cimarron answers to Price. The circuit court judge, a man named Aldous Kerr, was appointed through a process that Price significantly influenced." He looked at his brother. "Every official channel in 3 counties is compromised or intimidated. And a federal channel requires someone in the federal structure who isn't on Price's payroll and has enough authority to act on what I have without first routing it through the territorial system." "I know someone," Asa said. He said it simply and without elaboration, and Frank looked at him with the particular expression of a younger sibling encountering evidence that the older sibling's complicated past included useful elements he hadn't previously disclosed. Who? A federal investigator I did work for, Asa said, during the years I don't talk about. His name is Josephine Tate. She's based in Denver but her jurisdiction covers the New Mexico and Colorado territories. We haven't spoken in 6 years but she's honest, genuinely, specifically honest in a way that the work she does requires and that the years hadn't changed last time I had direct knowledge of it. Frank looked at him. Yes, Asa said. Can you reach her? If I can get to a telegraph office that isn't being monitored by Price's people, Asa said. Which means not Cimarron. He thought for a moment. There's a trading post a day's ride south. The man who runs it isn't connected to anything in this county. He'd send a telegraph for me. If you leave the mountain, Price's watchers will see you in the valley, Frank said. I left a man watching the Red Mesa and walked out of Cimarron through the back alleys, Asa said. I'll manage the valley. He looked at his brother's thin, exhausted face. How long can you hold this position safely? Frank considered honestly. A week, maybe less if they send more men into the valley. He looked at the oilskin package on the table. Asa, this documentation represents 11 families whose livelihoods were stolen. Not just me. If Price gets his hands on this and destroys it, those families have nothing. No proof, no recourse, nothing. He met his brother's eyes. Be careful with it, more careful than with yourself. Asa looked at his brother for a long moment, taking in the 11 months of mountain survival and the specific weight of what Frank had been carrying alone through all of it. Not just the physical documentation but the knowledge, the responsibility, the sustained isolation of a man who couldn't trust anyone enough to come down from a mountain. I'll be careful, he said. With both, getting down from the Moreno Valley cabin and through the valley floor without being observed by Price's searchers required both planning and patience, and Asa spent the first 2 hours after dawn studying the valley from a high position above the cabin with his spyglass, a quality instrument he'd carried for 20 years and trusted as he trusted few manufactured things. What he saw confirmed Cutter's information. 3 men working the valley systematically, moving on foot in a pattern that covered the valley's accessible terrain in overlapping sweeps that would eventually reach the cabin's location unless something changed. He left Frank with his rifle, the documentation secured, and a clear instruction to remain in the cabin regardless of what he heard unless the specific signal they had agreed on reached him. Then Asa began the careful work of moving through terrain that was being actively searched. The skill required was one he had developed over years of work that had asked it of him repeatedly, and it was one that didn't deteriorate as quickly as he'd hoped it would during 7 years of relative peace. He moved downhill through the timber using the specific technique of working with the terrain's natural features, staying in the timber's shadow rather than crossing open ground, moving when wind in the upper branches created sound cover, pausing when the valley went quiet in ways that meant the searchers were listening rather than moving. He located 2 of the 3 searchers by sound and position before he'd reached the valley floor, tracking their movement patterns the way he'd once tracked men in similar terrain for work he'd rather not remember in detail. The 3rd searcher was the problem, positioned at the valley's lower exit, sitting still rather than sweeping, covering the natural egress point with the patient attentiveness of someone assigned to watch rather than search. Asa observed him for 20 minutes from a sheltered position and assessed him as competent enough to make direct passage unacceptably risky. He needed a different exit. He found it, a secondary egress through a narrow rock fall channel that opened onto the north face of the valley's lower wall, accessible but uncomfortable, requiring a hands and feet descent of perhaps 60 feet of broken rock before the terrain leveled into open country. He made the descent with the care of someone for whom a broken ankle in this situation would be a fatal inconvenience, and reached the open country below without incident. His horse was where he'd left it. By mid-morning he was riding south toward the trading post, carrying Frank's oilskin documentation package inside his coat and the specific, focused urgency of someone who has a clock running in the back of their mind and is working against it. The trading post proprietor, the same Pueblo man who had given him coffee and careful advice on the road in, received Asa's request to use his telegraph connection without visible surprise, as though he'd been expecting something of this nature to arrive eventually. He produced the telegraph instrument from a back room that also contained enough other sophisticated equipment to indicate that the trading post's function in this part of the territory was considerably more complex than its appearance suggested. Asa composed the message to Josephine Tate with the specific economy of someone who knows that telegraph messages are read by more people than their intended recipients and has learned to communicate critical information in language that conveys nothing useful to the wrong reader. He identified himself with a code they had established 6 years ago for exactly this kind of contingency, stated that he had physical documentation of a multi-county cattle theft scheme operating through territorial records manipulation, identified the jurisdiction as Cimarron, Colfax County, and requested urgent field response with federal authority sufficient to bypass territorial officials. He waited at the trading post for the response, drinking the old man's excellent coffee and studying the oilskin package's contents with the methodical attention he'd been giving it since coming down the mountain. Frank's documentation was better than Cutter's description had prepared him for. Not just the photographs and copies, but a handwritten analysis in Frank's careful script that traced the full pattern of the 11 seizures, their timing, their methodology, the specific document numbers that connected the original leases to the territorial office alterations. Frank had been doing this work alone in a mountain cabin for 11 months, and the quality of what he'd produced reflected both the time he'd had and the particular stubborn intelligence that had always characterized his approach to things. The response from Josephine Tate arrived 3 hours later, which was faster than Asa had expected and communicated something about her current operational status. Either she was already in the field somewhere in the territory, or the message had reached her through a relay that put her closer than Denver. The message was equally coded but clear in its essentials. She had existing information on Price and the Cimarron operation from a parallel investigation. She was 2 days out with federal authority and 3 deputies, and she needed Asa to secure the documentation and keep it secure until her arrival. 2 days. Frank had said a week at most in the mountain cabin, which gave them adequate margin, but adequate margin was not comfortable margin. Asa sent one final message confirming his location and the documentation status, then went to the proprietor and made arrangements for an extended stay that the old man accepted with the same unhurried pragmatism he brought to everything. That evening, sitting in the trading post's back room with the oilskin package on the table before him, Asa thought about the 11 families whose stolen cattle were documented in Frank's photographs and records. He thought about 11 years of lease agreements altered by men who understood that institutional authority, once corrupted, becomes effectively invisible as corruption, that the fraud looks exactly like the legitimate process it has replaced. He thought about Commissioner Pitt in Santa Fe processing alterations with the casual efficiency of someone doing ordinary bureaucratic work, about Sheriff Briggs in Cimarron executing trespass proceedings against people whose leases said they had every right to be where they were, about Judge Kerr issuing findings that reflected not law but Price's operational requirements. The system working against itself, turned inside out by money and patience and the specific willingness to trust that most people never look behind what an official document says to examine whether what it says is true. He understood this kind of corruption in the specific way of someone who had spent years working adjacent to it, sometimes against it and sometimes, in the work he preferred not to remember, in service of it. Which was its own form of understanding, and its own form of obligation. She arrived a day early, which Asa attributed partly to the compressed travel schedule of someone who had been moving fast and partly to the possibility that her existing investigation had already positioned her closer to Cimarron than the original distance estimate suggested. Josephine Tate was 42 years old and had spent 15 years as a federal investigator working land and resource fraud cases across 4 territories, and the years showed in her face not as aging but as the specific accumulation of intelligence that sustained field work produces, a face that had been trained by long observation to reveal nothing it didn't choose to reveal while reading everything it encountered. She was of medium height, dark-haired, dressed practically in trail clothes that had been used hard and maintained carefully, and she carried 2 guns with the ease of someone for whom they were professional tools rather than statements. She came into the trading post with the specific quality of someone who has been moving fast and has arrived at the right place and is now making the full transition from travel to work, which in her case was barely perceptible because for Josephine Tate there had never been much separation between the two. She looked at Asa across the trading post's main room, and something moved in her expression that was neither surprise nor warmth exactly but belonged to both families of feeling. Asa Dillon, she said. 6 years. Nearly 7, he said. You look like someone who's been living quietly, she said. The eyes are the same, though. They don't change. She sat down across the table from the oilskin package and her 3 deputies, competent, quiet men who spread themselves through the trading post space with the professional efficiency of people accustomed to covering ground, arranged themselves outside without being told to. She picked up the package and began working through its contents with the specific speed of someone who reads this kind of documentation regularly and knows exactly where to look for the essential elements. She was quiet for 15 minutes. Asa poured coffee from the proprietor's excellent pot and left a cup beside her and didn't interrupt. When she set down the last page she looked across the table at him and said, "Your brother has been doing very careful work." "He's stubborn," Asa said. "Always has been. This is sufficient for federal charges against Price and Pitt both," she said. Price for the cattle theft and the manufactured trespass proceedings, Pitt for the records manipulation and abuse of official authority. Possibly others depending on what we find when we get into Price's operational records. She tapped the photographs. These lease originals against the territorial copies. The discrepancies are specific enough that they can't be attributed to administrative error. Someone made deliberate changes, and Pitt's office processed every one. She looked at Asa steadily. I need to get to your brother. His sworn testimony combined with this documentation makes the case airtight. He's in the Moreno Valley, Asa said. I need to go back up to get him down safely. Price has watchers in the valley. How many? 3 as of yesterday morning. Possibly more since then if they increased their search density after losing my trail. Tate looked at her deputies. We go in with federal authority visible, she said. Not concealed. Price's people in that valley are trespassing on public land in the course of an illegal operation. We don't sneak around them, we walk up and identify ourselves and give them the choice that federal authority creates. She looked at Asa. You know the terrain. Better than I'd like to, he said. Let's go get my brother. They went into the Moreno Valley the following morning, Asa, Tate, and 2 of the 3 deputies, leaving the 3rd at the valley entrance with the horses and a clear instruction about what to do if the party didn't emerge by sunset. The 4th person, a woman Tate introduced only as Claire who carried a medical bag and moved through difficult terrain with the ease of long practice, came as an addition Asa hadn't anticipated and was glad to have. 11 months in a mountain cabin with sustained anxiety and limited provisions was not a condition that left a man in his best physical state, regardless of how stubborn he was. The valley's searchers had increased to 5, which Asa registered on the approach with the systematic sweep of his spyglass from the high position above the valley floor. Tate studied them for a moment and then walked down into the valley openly, her federal badge on her coat and her hand nowhere near her weapons, with Asa and the deputies flanking her at the specific distance that communicated federal authority without unnecessary aggression. The confrontation with Price's searchers lasted approximately 4 minutes. 3 of the 5 responded to Tate's federal identification and the clear statement of her legal authority with the rapid, deflating compliance of men who have been hired for enforcement work against civilians and have not been prepared for the different category of problem that a federal investigator with a warrant represents. The 4th needed an additional statement about the specific charges he was personally at risk of if he continued to obstruct a federal investigation, which Tate delivered in the flat, precise tone of someone reading from a statute. The 5th, the most capable of the group, Asa had assessed him from the beginning as the one most likely to make a different choice, looked at the geometry of the situation for a long moment and then dropped his hand from his weapon and stepped back, which was the most intelligent decision available to him and which he clearly recognized as such. Tate had them secured and under her deputy's supervision within 15 minutes. Then she looked at Asa and nodded. He went up the mountain trail to the cabin, gave the signal they'd agreed on, and waited. The cabin door opened and Frank Dillon came out squinting into the mountain light with the specific, complicated expression of a man emerging from 11 months of confined hiding, relief and wariness simultaneously, relief that it was over and wariness that was too deeply ingrained to release immediately just because the situation said it was safe to. He looked at his brother and then down the mountain at the federal presence in the valley below and then back at Asa. Federal investigator, he said. Her name is Josephine Tate, Asa said. She's been building a case against Price from a different direction for months. Your documentation closes her case and her authority closes yours. Frank stood in the mountain sunlight and Asa watched the 11 months of tension move through his brother's face and begin, slowly and not yet completely, to release. Claire the medical officer went up the trail to meet him and Frank submitted to her brief assessment with the rueful, slightly embarrassed compliance of a man who is not entirely well and knows it and has not had occasion to do anything about it. Is it finished? Frank said, over Claire's head. Not yet, Asa said honestly. We still have Price and Pitt in the court proceedings. But the piece you've been carrying alone is finished. He met his brother's eyes. You can come down from the mountain now, Frank. Frank Dillon looked at the valley below, at the federal marshals and the secured searchers and the specific, visible presence of authority that had come for the right reasons. Then he picked up the rifle he'd been carrying for 11 months and walked down the mountain trail with his brother, and Asa watched him and felt something in his own chest that had been tight since he'd opened a dead man's letter 3 weeks ago finally and completely loosen. The arrest of Harlan Price was conducted the following morning at the Cimarron Cattle Company office on the main plaza, and it was conducted with the specific combination of federal authority and documented evidence that made resistance not merely futile but actively self-defeating in ways that even Price's considerable resources could not immediately address. Price received Tate's arrival with the composed, calculating manner of a man who has been in difficult situations before and has usually found his way through them using money and institutional leverage, and who had not yet fully processed that both of those resources had been comprehensively outmaneuvered by 11 months of careful work in a mountain cabin. He was 55, well-built, with the kind of face that suggested a history of getting what it wanted and had developed the permanent expression of confident expectation as a result. He looked at Tate's federal warrant and at Frank Dillon standing behind her and at the oilskin package in Tate's hand, and the confident expectation went through several rapid revisions before arriving at something that was still controlled but was no longer confident. Commissioner Pitt will contest any assertion about the territorial records, he said, which was still the language of a man playing his resources rather than a man who has acknowledged they've been surpassed. Commissioner Pitt was arrested in Santa Fe this morning, Tate said. My deputy there moved simultaneously with this arrest. Pitt has been in federal custody for 4 hours. She paused. He's already cooperating, which you should know before you make any decisions about your own approach to this situation. Something broke in Price's composed face, not dramatically, but definitively, the specific internal fracture of a man whose institutional protection has just been simultaneously removed from multiple directions at once. He looked at Frank Dillon for a long moment. You've been in the mountains for almost a year, he said, with something that was almost admiration. I had men looking for you the whole time. I know, Frank said. They weren't good enough. Price looked at the documentation in Tate's hand. 11 families worth of stolen livelihoods, 8 years of institutional fraud, a scheme that had been moving like a machine through the territory's records offices until a stubborn young cattleman had refused to surrender his lease and had instead grabbed a camera and climbed a mountain. He straightened slightly and said, I'll need to speak with my lawyer. That's your right, Tate said. The marshals will accommodate you. She looked at the 2 deputies flanking Price. Take him. Sheriff Briggs received the news of Price's arrest with the specific, deflating resignation of a man who has been expecting a reckoning and is now experiencing the particular relief of something feared finally arriving. He was 30 years old and had taken the Cimarron sheriff's position 2 years ago through a process that Price had significantly influenced, and he had spent 2 years doing a version of law enforcement that had required him to consistently choose Price's operational needs over the actual law he'd been sworn to uphold, and the accumulation of those choices had left him in the specific condition of someone who can feel exactly how far they've traveled from where they intended to be. He presented himself at the federal deputy's position on the morning after Price's arrest and stated his willingness to cooperate fully, which Tate received with the flat, professional acceptance of someone who has seen this specific conversion many times and neither credits it with more integrity than it contains nor dismisses the genuine component of relief that it usually also contains. Briggs provided testimony regarding 4 specific proceedings in which he had enforced Price's manufactured trespass charges against ranchers whose leases he had known at the time were legitimate, and regarding 2 instances in which evidence contrary to Price's interests had been suppressed at Price's direction before reaching the court. Judge Aldous Kerr proved considerably more resistant. He received Tate's investigative team at his chambers with the indignant authority of a man who has spent enough years sitting behind a judicial bench that the authority has become his primary identity rather than his institutional role. He challenged the federal jurisdiction, challenged the evidentiary foundation, challenged the specific provisions of Tate's warrant with the technical, procedural objections of someone who understands the legal structure well enough to use it as a defense against itself. He was, Tate told Asa that evening, genuinely difficult. Kerr isn't stupid. He's not going to make the easy mistakes that Pitt and Price made. He's going to fight this through every available procedural channel, which means months before anything related to his conduct gets in front of a federal bench that can actually adjudicate it. Does that affect the ranchers' restitution? Asa said, not directly. The cattle theft and lease fraud cases against Price are independent of whatever Kerr did in his courtroom. Price's convictions don't require Kerr's cooperation. She looked at the documentation spread across the table in the hotel room they'd commandeered as a temporary operations center. But Kerr's conduct is part of the full accounting, and he knows it. He's going to fight because the alternative is to not fight, and men like Kerr don't not fight. What does not fighting look like for him? Asa said. Federal charges for judicial misconduct and abuse of authority, Tate said. Significantly reduced if he cooperates, significantly increased if he doesn't. She looked at Asa steadily. The thing about institutional corruption is that it always looks more solid than it is, right up until the moment it doesn't. Kerr built his security on Price's protection. Price's protection is gone. She paused. Give him a week. While the federal proceedings against Price, Pitt and their associates moved through their necessary stages. Asa and Frank spent 2 weeks in Cimarron engaged in the work that Tate had indicated was prerequisite to the restitution proceedings, locating and contacting the 11 affected ranching families and gathering their sworn statements regarding the circumstances of their dispossession. It was work that required traveling to 4 counties, and it was work that told a story in accumulated individual detail that the documentation alone had conveyed only in outline. Each family had its own version of the same narrative: the visit from Territorial Land Office representatives questioning legitimate leases, the manufactured trespass proceedings, the cattle seized as bond and never returned, the subsequent choice between continued legal resistance that required resources most of them didn't have and the practical surrender of moving on. Several families had indeed moved on, were now in different territories, in different work, the specific displaced trajectory of people who had been pushed off land they'd built their livelihoods on and had found the nearest available landing. 3 families were still in the area, managing reduced operations or working for other ranchers, living in the specific proximity to what had been taken from them that made each day a version of the same loss. The Munoz family, whose grazing lease on the Rayado River had been among the first seized, received Asa and Frank in a small house outside of Springer where they'd been living for 2 years on the husband's wages from a nearby mine. Elena Munoz, 52, listened to Frank's account of the documentation with the careful attention of someone afraid to fully believe something until belief can be safely committed to, and asked 3 specific questions about the lease photographs and the territorial records discrepancies that told Asa she understood exactly what had been done to her family and had spent 2 years thinking about it with great precision. When Frank confirmed that the documentation would support a full restitution claim, she sat very still for a long moment and then said, in a voice that was entirely controlled, "My husband's father built that grazing operation. 40 years. My husband worked it beside him. My sons grew up on it." She looked at the table. "They told us the paperwork said we were trespassing. I knew our lease. I knew the terms. But when the official document says one thing and your own copy says another, and the sheriff is standing there with the official document," she stopped. "You start to think you're wrong, even when you know you're right." She looked at Frank. "That's what they do. They make you think you're wrong." Frank met her eyes. "You weren't wrong," he said. "The paperwork was forged. Your lease was valid and is still valid. The restitution proceedings will confirm it." Elena Munoz looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked back at Frank and said, "Your brother spent 11 months in the mountains keeping that proof safe." It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Asa said. She looked at Asa steadily. "Thank him for my family," she said. Asa looked at his brother. "He's right here," he said. "Tell him yourself." Tate's prediction about Judge Kerr proved accurate in its timeline if not quite in its mechanism. He held out for 8 days of procedural resistance and then, on the 9th morning, appeared at the Federal Operations Room in the Cimarron Hotel with the specific, controlled dignity of a man who has made a decision and intends to execute it without drama. He was accompanied by his own lawyer, which was appropriate, and he submitted a comprehensive statement of cooperation that covered every instance of judicial conduct influenced by Price's interests over the 4 years of their arrangement. Kerr's statement was, in its own way, the most complete document the investigation produced, more detailed than Pitt's cooperation, more structured than Whitlock's testimony in the parallel case Tate mentioned from another county. He described the mechanics of the arrangement with Price in the specific, precise language of a trained legal mind applying its full capacity to the task it had been given, and the result was a document that closed every remaining gap in the institutional picture of how Price's operation had been protected from legitimate legal challenge. He named 3 additional officials, 2 in adjacent counties, 1 in the territorial legislature, whose cooperation with Price's interests had been coordinated through his own courtroom, extending the investigation's scope beyond what either Tate or the federal prosecutors had previously mapped. Asa sat in on Kerr's statement, observing rather than participating, and watched a man who had spent 4 years corrupting the institution he'd sworn to uphold spend several hours producing the most thorough accounting of that corruption available. He thought about the Munoz family and the 10 others, about the specific thing Elena Munoz had said, "They make you think you're wrong, even when you know you're right," and about the function that institutional authority performs in that process, the way a forged document with an official seal becomes more believable than the truth because the seal carries weight that the truth, unendorsed, cannot match. That evening he walked the Cimarron River bank alone, the way he sometimes walked when he needed the specific kind of thinking that only happened in motion, and he thought about the 7 years in Creed's Hollow and the livery stable in Pico with the horses and the life he'd built around the deliberate absence of complication. He thought about Frank in the mountain cabin with his camera and his documents and 11 months of stubborn persistence. He thought about the work he'd once done and the reasons he'd stopped doing it and whether those reasons had changed, and what the answer to that question was going to require of him going forward. He didn't arrive at a final answer by the time he returned to the hotel. But he arrived at the shape the federal court proceedings against Harlan Price lasted 3 weeks and produced convictions on 41 separate charges covering 8 years of cattle theft, lease fraud, and conspiracy to corrupt territorial officials across 4 counties. Commissioner Gerald Pitt received his own set of convictions for abuse of official authority and fraud in territorial records, with a sentence that reflected both the duration and the systematic nature of his participation. Judge Kerr received reduced charges reflecting his comprehensive cooperation, sufficient to end his judicial career and involve a period of imprisonment that the court described in its sentencing as the minimum consistent with the gravity of what he had done. The restitution proceedings, conducted by a separate federal civil process running parallel to the criminal cases, addressed the 11 families' claims with the methodical precision that Frank's documentation made possible. Each family's original lease terms were confirmed against the authenticated photographs, the territorial office records corrected to reflect the authentic terms, and the cattle theft quantified against the documentary evidence of transfer that Frank had assembled. The total restitution ordered, cattle values, lost grazing income over the seizure period, legal costs incurred, came to amounts that would not make whole what had been lost in terms of years and the specific irreplaceable quality of time spent on land that was taken, but that constituted the full financial accounting the legal process could provide. Several of the displaced families were able to return to their original grazing territories. The Munoz family received confirmation that their Rayado River lease remained valid and was among the first to re-establish active grazing operations on the land, which Elena Munoz managed with a systematic efficiency that suggested she had spent 2 years in that small house outside Springer planning exactly how she would use the day this became possible. 3 families chose not to return, had built sufficiently into their new situations that returning represented a different kind of disruption than staying had, which was itself a kind of loss that the restitution proceedings couldn't fully address but that Tate noted in the official record as a category of damage that the court should formally acknowledge even if it could not financially compensate. Frank received full confirmation of his Mora River lease and the documentation of his cattle's theft, with a restitution award that would allow him to rebuild his operation from the specific point at which it had been interrupted 11 months ago, carrying forward rather than starting over. He stood in the federal court's corridor after the final restitution order was issued and looked at the official document confirming what he'd spent 11 months in a mountain cabin protecting, and he said nothing for a long moment, which was unlike Frank, who was generally the more talkative of the 2 brothers. "You all right?" Asa said. "I'm thinking," Frank said. "About what?" "About what you do with yourself after you've been doing one thing for 11 months, Frank said. "How you remember what normal is?" "You go home," Asa said. "You work your land. You let normal come back at its own pace." Frank looked at him. "What about you? Going back to Creed's Hollow?" Asa didn't answer immediately. He looked at the corridor window, at the Cimarron afternoon light coming through it, and thought about Josephine Tate's offer, made quietly the previous evening over the good coffee the hotel had finally started providing, of a consulting arrangement with her federal investigative unit, work that would use what he knew without requiring him to be what he'd been, work with the specific purpose of preventing what had happened to Frank's 11 families from happening to others before someone spent 11 months in a mountain cabin collecting the proof. "I don't know yet," he said. Which was honest, and was the only honest answer. She made the offer formally on the final morning of the Cimarron proceedings, over breakfast in the hotel dining room with the specific directness that characterized everything she did. "I've been building this unit for 3 years, she said. Cases like Price's are the unit's reason for existing, institutional corruption using official machinery against ordinary people who don't have the resources or the authority to fight it through conventional channels." She looked at Asa steadily. "The skill set you have, the field craft, the ability to move through difficult situations without official visibility, the specific knowledge of how these operations work from the inside, I don't find that combination easily in people who are also genuinely interested in using it for the right purposes." "The right purposes," Asa said. "The 11 families," she said simply. "That's the purpose. Finding the next operation before it runs 11 more families off their land, getting the evidence in front of the right authority before someone has to spend a year hiding in the mountains to protect it." She held his gaze. "You walked away from difficult work 7 years ago for reasons I don't entirely know and won't ask about. But the work I'm offering isn't the same work, and I think you know the difference." Asa looked at his coffee cup. He did know the difference. He'd known it since the night in the Red Mesa back room when Cutter had laid out Price's operation and Asa had felt the specific, uncomfortable re-engagement of capacities he'd been trying to let rest. The difference between using those capacities in service of what they'd been used for before and using them in service of what Tate was describing was the difference between the two distinct categories that those 7 years in Creed's Hollow had taught him to see clearly. Creed's Hollow, he said. My livery stable. There's a 15-year-old boy named Pico who has been running it for the last 3 weeks. I know, Tate said. I looked into your situation when you contacted me. Pico sounds competent. He is, Asa said. Then he can continue to be competent while you decide what you want to do, she said. I'm not asking for immediate commitment. I'm asking whether the conversation is worth continuing. Asa looked at the window. Outside, Cimarron was conducting its ordinary morning business. Horses, deliveries, the school teacher crossing the plaza, the newspaper office receiving paper from a morning wagon. The ordinary life of a town that had been conducting that life throughout everything that had happened within it, indifferent to the corruption underneath and to the specific people who had worked to remove it. He thought about Frank building back his cattle operation on the Mora River. He thought about Elena Munoz returning to the Rayado River grazing land. He thought about 11 families and then about how many other families, in other counties, in other territories, were sitting in the same manufactured situation without a Frank Dillon willing to spend 11 months in a mountain cabin and an Asa Dillon willing to ride 4 days toward a dead man's letter. The conversation is worth continuing, he said. Tate nodded, the specific, contained satisfaction of someone who expected that answer and is now prepared to work with it. Good, she said. She poured more coffee. Tell me everything you remember about how Price's operation was structured. I want to understand what the next version of it is going to look like before it starts. Asa picked up his cup and started talking, and outside the Cimarron morning continued its ordinary business, and somewhere north of town in the Moreno Valley a mountain cabin sat empty for the first time in 11 months, its door unlocked now, needing nothing from anyone. Frank Dillon rode back to the Mora River bottomland on a Tuesday morning in late November, which was further into the season than ideal for re-establishing a cattle operation but early enough that the winter's full weight hadn't yet committed itself to the land. He went alone, which was his preference and which Asa had accepted after a brief argument that Frank won by pointing out, reasonably, that he had managed 11 months in a mountain cabin alone and could manage an hour's ride to his own property. The land was exactly as he'd left it. The specific, detailed accuracy of natural places that don't register human absence the way human-built things do. The grass had gone dormant in the November cold, the river was running lower than summer but clear, the cottonwood trees along the bank had dropped their leaves and stood in the clean, structural beauty of bare branches against a pale winter sky. The fence lines he'd built needed maintenance, 11 months of weather had taken its predictable toll, and the small house he'd built the year before his lease dispute began needed a season's worth of deferred upkeep addressed before winter arrived in earnest. He stood in the yard of that house for a long time before going inside, not from reluctance but from the specific, deliberate intention of a man marking a moment he understood to be significant. He had spent 11 months protecting the proof that this land was legally his, that the lease terms were authentic, that no forged document in a territorial records office could override what he'd built here. The proof had done what proof was for. The land remained. He remained. The work of restoring both to productive operation now began. He wrote to Asa that evening, a brief letter that said more in its plainness than elaboration would have managed. I'm home. Land looks good. Fence needs work. Starting with the fence. Come visit when you have a free week. Frank. Josephine Tate's Federal Investigative Unit received its next case referral 3 weeks after the Cimarron proceedings closed, which was faster than any of them had expected and which Tate noted without surprise as characteristic of a problem that doesn't pause while its most recent instance is being addressed. The referral came from a ranching family in the Pecos River Valley, 2 counties east of Cimarron, describing a pattern of territorial records inquiries regarding their grazing leases that bore a specific, uncomfortable resemblance to the opening phase of Price's operational methodology. Asa read the referral summary in Tate's temporary office. She had commandeered space in the Cimarron courthouse while the federal proceedings closed out their administrative requirements, and recognized in the described pattern the specific signature of an operation that had learned from what Price had built and was now running a refined version of it. The territorial records approach was more sophisticated, the official pretense more carefully constructed, the initial contact with the affected families more calibrated to avoid the kind of obvious pressure that had pushed Frank toward documentation and resistance. Someone looked at what happened to Price, Asa said, and built a better version. Yes, Tate said, which is why we need to be in the Pecos Valley before they reach the stage Price reached when Frank started documenting. She looked at Asa. Are you ready to travel? He thought about Creed's Hollow and Pico and the livery stable. He thought about the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago with his stable boy's handwriting, Horses all fine, everything in order, Pico, which was the full content of the communication and was entirely sufficient. He thought about the Munoz family on the Rayado River and whether the family in the Pecos Valley had children who would grow up watching their parents lose what they'd built if no one arrived in time. Yes, he said. When do we leave? The Pecos River Valley in December was a different landscape from the dusty summer aridity that most people associated with New Mexico, and Asa rode into it with Tate and two deputies on a morning when frost lay on the brown grass and the river ran steel gray under an overcast sky that promised snow before evening. The valley was wide and open, cattle country in the specific sense of land that had been used for cattle long enough that the land itself showed the relationship. Trail lines worn into hillsides, water gaps cut through fence lines, the particular way the grass grew in areas that had been managed through seasons of grazing and recovery. The affected family was the Archer family, father, mother, 3 adult children who all worked the operation, the specific configuration of a generational cattle enterprise that had been built over 20 years into something substantial. James Archer, the father, was 61, with the weathered permanence of a man grown into his land over decades, and he received Asa and Tate at his ranch house with the wariness of someone who has learned recently that official visitors don't always bring official intentions. "How did you find us?" he said, studying their federal credentials with careful attention. "A neighbor passed your situation to a contact who passed it to our unit," Tate said. "We're federal, not territorial. Whatever the territorial land office is telling you, we operate independently of Commissioner Pitt's office." She paused, noting his expression. "You know Pitt's name. One of his representatives has been here twice in the last month," Archer said. "Asking questions about our original lease filings from 1871. His jaw tightened. "Our filing is clean. I've had it for 15 years and checked it 3 times, most recently last month when these questions started." "May I see it?" Tate said. He produced it, stored in a fireproof box with the specific, careful safekeeping of a man who had been warned by recent events that documents require protection. Tate examined it alongside the copy she'd brought of the territorial office's current version of the same filing. The discrepancies, this time, were more subtle than in Frank's case, smaller adjustments, less obvious on casual comparison, reflecting the refinement Asa had identified in the referral summary. But they were there. Asa found the first one, a water access provision adjusted by a single clause that removed the Archers' priority claim during drought conditions, and Tate found 2 more within minutes. The operation was running, just more carefully than Price had run his. "Mr. Archer," Tate said, "your lease is being altered. Whoever is doing this is more careful than the last operation we dismantled, but they're making the same fundamental error, they're assuming no one is looking closely enough to catch it." She looked at him steadily. "We are. And we're going to need your cooperation to document what's happening before it reaches the enforcement stage." James Archer looked at the 2 versions of his lease side by side on his kitchen table, and Asa watched him recognize, with the specific, illuminating clarity of something long suspected being confirmed, that his instinct about the territorial representatives had been correct from the first visit. "What do you need?" Archer said. "Everything," Tate said. "Every visit, every communication, every name. And your original filing, which I'd like to place in federal protective custody effective immediately." She looked at him. "And any neighbors who may have received similar visits. The more documentation we have before they escalate, the shorter this process is and the less damage it does." The Pecos Valley investigation opened, in its first 2 weeks, into something larger than a single valley or a single operation. The methodology they were encountering had been deployed in 5 different locations across New Mexico and Colorado over the preceding 18 months, each instance more refined than the previous, each building on the operational lessons of what had come before. The architecture above the individual operations, the financial structure, the institutional relationships, the coordination mechanism, was more sophisticated than Price's arrangement had been, suggesting either that Price had not been an originator but a participant in something that had learned from his prosecution and adapted, or that someone entirely new had studied the Price case as a model and was deliberately building a better version. Tate spent 3 evenings laying out what they were assembling across a table covered in documents and maps and connection diagrams, and Asa watched the picture emerge with the specific discomfort of someone who recognizes a pattern they've seen before in different clothes. "This isn't one operation," he said on the 3rd evening. "These 5 valley cases are each locally managed by someone like Price, a local operator with local institutional relationships. But the records manipulation is being coordinated from a single point. Look at the timing of the alterations across all 5 cases." He traced the pattern across Tate's map. Each set of alterations was processed within a 2-week window. Different territorial offices, different counties, different local operators. But the same 2-week window, 3 months in a row. Tate stared at the map for a long moment. Commissioner Pitt cooperated, she said. He named everyone he knew in Price's operation. He didn't name anyone connected to these other cases. Because Pitt didn't know about them, Asa said. He was Price's piece of the structure. Someone above both of them is running the coordination, using different territorial officials in each location. He paused. There's a common funding source for the land acquisitions across all 5 valleys. I can see it in the financial documentation, different company names, different local operators, but the capital flows through the same financial structure. He looked at Tate. Frank found something similar with Price. 2 layers of shell companies before you reach the actual money. The money above Price led to Pitt, Tate said slowly. And Pitt was territorial, but the money above these 5 cases is something else, Asa said. Larger, better hidden. He looked at the map. This is going to take longer than Cimarron did. Tate looked at him with the flat, direct expression that meant she had already arrived at the same conclusion and was assessing his response to it. Yes, she said. Are you still in? Asa looked at the map. 5 valleys, 5 families initially identified, likely more cases they hadn't yet found, a coordination structure above it all that would require the kind of sustained, careful investigation that the Cimarron case had taken months and the larger structure would take longer. He thought about what Elena Munoz had said. They make you think you're wrong, even when you know you're right. He thought about the function of that specific operation, not just the theft, but the institutional manipulation of reality itself, the specific cruelty of using official authority to make people distrust their own documented truth. I'm in, he said. Spring came to New Mexico while the investigation was still running, which was characteristic of investigations of sufficient scope, the world continuing its business while the specific, careful work of dismantling a large and sophisticated criminal enterprise proceeded at the pace that thoroughness required rather than the pace that urgency preferred. Asa had been working with Tate's unit for 5 months by the time the investigation's full scope came into focus, and in those 5 months he had been in 4 territories, 7 cities, and more difficult conversations than he'd had in the previous 7 years combined. The coordination structure above the 5 valley operations turned out to connect to a financial entity based in Denver with subsidiary relationships in 3 eastern banking institutions that had been providing capital for land acquisitions across the Southwest under the assumption, or the deliberate fiction, that the acquisitions were legitimate development investments. The entity's principals, when identified through the specific, painstaking process of financial trail documentation that 2 of Tate's analysts spent 3 months on, included 2 individuals with Federal Land Commission connections, not territorial officials like Pitt, but actual federal appointments, people whose authority extended above the territorial level and whose participation in the scheme explained why the coordination could reach across multiple territorial boundaries simultaneously. The arrests, when they came, were conducted in 8 locations on the same morning, the same coordinated federal action that Tate had used in Cimarron, scaled to the broader operations geography. Asa was in Denver for the central arrests, which were the most operationally complex and which Tate had positioned her most experienced people for, including herself, including Asa. He stood outside the Denver Financial Building afterward while the arrested principals were processed into federal custody, and he thought about a livery stable in Creeds Hollow and a boy named Pico who had been running it for 5 months with the kind of competence that made his employer's absence both possible and slightly unnecessary. He thought about Frank's letter from 2 weeks ago, fences fixed. Second calf crop looks good. Come see when this business of yours is finished, and the specific, grounded quality of those 2 sentences against the 5 months of complicated, mobile, mentally demanding work the business of his had required. Tate stood beside him. The federal prosecutors estimate 18 months of proceedings, she said. The financial structure is complex enough that it's going to take that long to untangle completely in court. And the Valley families, Asa said. Protected under federal order as of this morning, she said. All 5 valleys, plus 9 additional cases we identified in the investigation's expansion. No further lease interference, territorial records corrected under federal supervision. She paused. The restitution process will take longer, it always does. But the interference is stopped. Asa looked at the Denver street. The specific, busy quality of a city that had been conducting its commercial life throughout everything that had happened in the territories to the south and west, indifferent to ranching families and forged leases and mountain cabins and 11 months of stubborn resistance. I'm going to go see my brother, he said. And then I'm going to go back to Creeds Hollow for a month. Tate looked at him. And after the month, He thought about the next referral that was probably already sitting in Tate's correspondence, waiting for the current proceedings to reach a state that freed her unit for the next iteration of the same problem in a different valley with different family names and the same institutional machinery turned against them. He thought about what the work actually was, not dramatic, not resolving in clean final moments, not finished when any particular case closed. Continuous, requiring the specific combination of skills and patience and willingness he'd spent 7 years in Creed's Hollow trying to convince himself weren't needed anymore. After the month, he said, "I'll be ready for the next one." Tate nodded with the contained, knowing expression of someone who expected exactly that answer and had arranged her operational planning accordingly. "Good," she said, "I'll have something for you by then." She turned back toward the building where the morning's proceedings were still generating their administrative consequences. "Go see your brother, Asa. The work will be here when you get back." He rode south out of Denver that afternoon on the same reliable horse that had carried him out of Creed's Hollow 6 months ago, heading toward the Mora River and Frank's fence line and the specific, grounded simplicity of cattle and land and the kind of work that showed you exactly what you'd done at the end of every day. He would stay a month, as he'd told Tate. Maybe 5 weeks. And then the road would open again toward the next valley and the next family and the next version of the same essential problem, which was the problem of power arranged against ordinary people and the specific, necessary work of standing in between. He rode south and the spring light moved across the New Mexico high country with the patient, indifferent beauty it always had, and somewhere in the Mora River Valley a cattle operation was building back toward what it had been. And somewhere in Creed's Hollow a boy named Pico was keeping the horses in excellent condition, and the work that waited was exactly what it had always been, difficult, necessary, without a final ending, entirely worth doing.